computer. We got it, folks. So I'm gonna toss to David Eisenberg.
Let me go back to screen sharing, make a few introductory comments, and then I will turn the floor over to our guest, Alon. Thank you for joining us tonight. I know this will be an engaging and informative conversation. A little bit about my role. My name is David Eisenberg. I'm a longtime participant in the ride, and since 2012, I've had the honor and pleasure and demands of being vice chair of the ride. A couple of quick introductory comments. First of all, as you can see from the slides that I hope are scrolling on your screens, Alon's relationship with the Israel Ride literally goes back to the very beginning. And I think that over that time, he's probably filled almost every role that somebody could fill on the ride. He's been a rider. He's been there with one of his kids. He's been a parent. He's been a member of the crew. He's been a guide, an environmental educator, and even a musician. But most important to me is that before the Israel Ride was founded, Alon founded the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. And it's ultimately his vision, including using cross-border environmental education to bring people together and build the kinds of bridges you need to have trust and cooperation and ultimately peace in Israel and the region. And that's what the Israel Ride exists to support. It's why we ride. I think it's worth noting Alon's journey is, to me, very emblematic of the modern Israeli story. He is involved in Young Judea. He became a new Olim to Israel. He was part of kibbutz life, living at Kibbutz Ketorah. He rose up through academia, became a leader in the environmental movement, founded the Arava Institute, and has served in the Israeli government. It's a journey I think each of us can admire, and I know that each of us can learn from the insights he brings to us about Israel. And with that, let me turn the floor over to him.
Well, David, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with everybody, and I want to thank you for having me and showing that quite extraordinary series of photographs, which certainly whet my appetite to get back on a bicycle. Indeed, I think it was 2003, the first Israel Ride that I went with my eldest daughter, Mika. She was 12, and we had no idea. Neither of us had ever bicycled more than maybe 2 or 3 kilometers around the Kibbutz Ketorah perimeter. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves on this incredible odyssey down to Eilat, which continues to this day. And I hope that to see many or all of you this year. I'm not in the Knesset, unfortunately, as when the ride begins. Next year, I surely will be, but this year I won't be. So that means I have more time maybe to get on the bike and spend some time with you all. I was asked to speak a little bit about politics today. Usually I'm on a green message, but I'm happy to do so. Let me start off by recognizing, at least on my first screen, my two very important friends here, arguably the most influential madriach and guide one could ever have, Shai Rabkin, who's on there. He's also the man who gave the great wisdom about the Israel Ride. It's the only place in the world where you can cycle for 130 kilometers and still put on weight. I remember that was his insight. And Stuart Diamond Cohen, who has been a great friend and partner in all kinds of philanthropic ventures. So it's great to see you. And as I see other people appear on the screen, I'll say hi. I'd like to say a word or two about myself, because I think this gives a framing for what I'd like to talk about politically. I grew up in North Carolina. Small Jewish community, Durham, and then later moved to Raleigh with my parents. I think I was informed in retrospect by two, I wouldn't say competing, two complementary impulses. On the one hand, we were a highly political family. It was somewhat unusual in the 1960s in Durham. I was a very small boy, but my mother held parlor meetings for African-American politicians, which in the South was sort of unusual for a white family. And I remember the strong feeling in the 1960s that there was something going on with the Duke students marching and the sit-ins and all this kind of thing that even a 6 or 7-year-old could pick up. I think I was old enough when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated even to understand what happened. And so at a very young age, I had a sense that if you want to make a difference, you have to get into politics. I was president of my high school class, even though I was a relatively new kid in town. And it was clear to me that my future destiny would lead me somehow or other to the US Congress or something to that effect, because that was where I should be. But I had a competing impulse, which was a very Zionistic one, a strong family background in the Jewish community. And as I became more involved in Young Judea and translated that into sort of a broader macro perspective, it seemed to me unimaginable that there would be this third Jewish Commonwealth and I wouldn't be part of it. And so I went off on the year course when I was 17. And then after I finished college, I came on my 20th birthday to Israel and more or less stayed there ever since, although I've had intermittent academic absences like the present one. I'm sitting broadcast to you from the Stanford University Graduate School of Business, where I've been for the last 6 months teaching a course and writing a book. Now, I'd like to say a word or two about Israel's democracy, because it's been in the news a lot, and I think it's very important to all of us. And as I promised, I'm going to set my clock here, and I'll make my comments brief and hopefully sufficiently provocative that people who are on the screen, as I recognize them increasingly, are quite familiar with a lot of things about Israel, and maybe we can engage in a better discussion or question. But I went into the Israeli Knesset after having tried many, many times. Like I said, it was important to me. When I got elected to the Knesset, it was, my wife says, proof perfect that the chaos theory exists. In other words, a butterfly in Brazil flapped its wings and all kinds of crazy things happened. And the next thing you know, Alon Tal got into the Knesset. And the truth of the matter, I had tried several times. The way I got in practice was that there was a new law, which continues now, called locally the Norwegian law. In Norway, when a member of parliament wishes to become a minister, they can do so, but they're given a safety net. In other words, if they change their mind, either because they get fired or they just don't like being a minister, they can return and resume their position as a parliamentarian, which does a lot for encouraging them to do so. Otherwise, they would just stay parliamentarians and we'd lose, or the lines between the executive and the legislative branch would be further blurred. So Israel adopted that policy, and I had been on the list with Benny Gantz from the day he started the Blue and White Party. Benny Gantz was my commanding officer in the paratroopers, and I thought at the time he was an exceptional person, an amazing leader, and I still feel that way, having worked with him now closely in the political arena. And so I ran with him, but there was another woman by the name of Miki Khaimovich, who was Israel's leading news broadcaster for 20 years, a household name, and very much, I would say, a formidable environmentalist in her own right. And she was ahead of me on the list, and it was clear that Benny wasn't going to have two green people in the list. So I was sitting there back in a supporting role. But Miki jumped ship when she was unhappy with the unity government that existed with Bibi Netanyahu. And a lot of people jumped ship with her. The next thing I knew, I was number 11 on the list, and the Norwegian law came into effect. Blue and White went in the government. We had only 8 seats, but 3 people became ministers, and they resigned their seat. And that meant that I could become a member of Knesset. The reason I say it, because it gave me this really idiosyncratic identity. All my life, I'd been in Israel 40 years by that point. I had imagined that I was an American Israeli. That's how people, perceived me when they heard the accent. But all of a sudden, overnight, I became a Scandinavian. I was a Norwegian. It's funny because the article in it's called Israel Hayom, Israel Today, the right-wing Likud paper, which basically lampooned all of us Norwegian members, there were about 20 of us who joined the Knesset, went through us all, and he said, Alon Tal, the head of the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University, he's tried to get in the Knesset 5 times. And I said, what do you mean 5 times? That's fake news. 7 times. Because, of course, I'd run 4 times with Benny Gantz. But I really did feel that it was something that was important to me initially as head of Israel's Green Party. And as I came to realize that in a parliamentary system, a small party like the Green Party was going to have a very hard time breaking through the so-called threshold, it made more sense to join a larger, more formidable party and be the Green camp within it. So that's how I originally got into the Knesset. And the first thing I discovered in the Knesset was that Knesset members don't actually have any power. But here's the thing. Nobody knows that. So if you are willing to pretend like you have influence, you can do a lot. And although I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we tried to do in the Knesset and which need to be done today, I think maybe some of the most important things that I'm most proud of were things that I did simply because I had the temerity or the chutzpah, whatever you want to call it, to just go out and pretend like I did have the authority. Nobody seemed to say otherwise. For example, there was a group of farmers who were trying to close off a a well in the Jerusalem hills that was a frequently hiked site. And there was a great consternation, and I certainly represented the Green people. And I went to the head of the Moshav, and he said, "Oh, well, why don't you be a arbitrator or a facilitator, what's it called, mediator in this conflict?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I think we reached some kind of reasonable conclusion. There was a case of the conservative synagogue. It's actually called the Chavurah in Tel Aviv, that was being unceremoniously thrown out of the high school they'd been for 20 years. And I wrote a letter to the Minister of Education, who at that time I wasn't even that close with her. Later, she joined our party and we became very close. And I said, "This is outrageous. A high school is joining in the overall oppression of non-Orthodox sects." And I sent the letter, a CC of my WhatsApp, to the principal. 20 minutes later, he called me up and rescinded his decision to throw them out. These are the kind of things you could do as a member of Knesset. But what I like most of all of being a member of Knesset was the fact that in the Israeli system, it's not a geographically representational system, which means you can pick your constituents. And I did so from the very first day. And there was 3 issues that I really felt that I was going to be on obviously, when you're in the Knesset, you have to be involved in everything and you have to vote on everything. But there were 3 issues that I felt that I need to raise as flags because I didn't feel other people would do it appropriately. The first was, of course, a representative of the environmental community and everything sustainability. And I had the good fortune to be the first chair of a subcommittee that addressed the problem of the climate crisis and environmental issues. And I think we had a lot of really important hearings, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second issue was religious pluralism. There was already a Reform rabbi in the Labor Party, Gilad Kariv, a close friend and colleague, but I felt like the conservative movement that I've been a part of for many, many years needed a representative in Knesset. And I felt that the 2 of us together did a good job, even though I felt that he was sometimes far more extreme than I thought we needed to be, but maybe that was a good balance, that I was a little more moderating and we could play good cop, bad cop when we needed to, et cetera. And the third issue that I would think I tried to be very involved in was the issue of women's rights, equal treatment of women, addressing the shameful, I would say, abuse of women in many, many contexts. My feeling was that this is a human rights issue. This is something should concern all Israelis. And if it's just something that Israeli women are involved in, then we're never going to make progress. So those are 3 issues that I was involved in. Now, a Knesset in a parliamentary system, particularly Israel's, has limited power. And that's because the executive branch is run according to the same lines exactly as the Knesset. And so if your party is in the coalition, that means your boss, your party chairman, is, if he's in the government, in my case, it was the Minister of Defense. So there was no way, even if I disagreed with the defense policy of Benny Gantz, which I did not, but if I had, I would not have said anything probably, because it would not have gotten me very far at all, and all kinds of things that I needed him to help me with in promoting my agenda as a parliamentarian, like getting my laws on agenda. And in this case, in the Haifa Bay, he was very helpful in closing down the big polluters and the like. So that's the first problem you have, is that you're locked into a broader political system. The other problem you have is as follows. There are 2 functions of all legislatures in the world. One is legislation, making laws, and the other one is oversight. Now, it turns out that Israel's Knesset is the world champion in legislation, at least by the metric of how many proposed bills are submitted. And that's because it's very easy. There's an unbearable lightness of submitting a bill. If you have an idea, you say, "Oh, great, I'll submit a bill. I'll get a headline in the newspaper." The fact that the chance of it passing is going to be minuscule. Let me welcome Mike Roth, Dr. Mark Roth, now a new member of the faculty in environmental sciences up in Colorado. Nice to see you, Mike, and avid biker, I might add. Anyway, I would argue that the notion that you can pass a law is very, very limited. Now, you do pass some laws, but it's more by chance. In a parliamentary system, you have to make sure that the government, the ministers, are on your side, which means that once you submit a law, you've got to get all those people who are involved in in their positions. If I'm submitting a law on climate, which I did, you've got to get the Minister of Energy on board, and the Minister of Justice, and the Agricultural Minister, and all these people online to support it. And they have their own bureaucracies and their own deep state, and it's very complicated to do that. So I've submitted a lot of laws, and I'm really glad that one of them is actually just passed, because my friend from Yesh Atid, Yorai Lav Haritzana, who's a Green parliamentarian from Yesh Atid, liked it, asked me, would I mind promoting? I said, well, I like it. Of course I would. And so, but the other side of this role, oversight, is something which is far more, I would say, salient for a Israeli parliamentarian. I really do feel that having many hearings on all sorts of issues where the executive branch wasn't doing its part, or where there was some, I would say, malfeasance or inadequacy, made a difference, where you could call the bureaucrats to order. Most of these issues are not even on the minister's radar screen. I had major disagreements with the Minister of Environment, and rather than take it out on her, I would just call her staff to task, and sometimes we got somewhere with that. And I thought that was very important in doing that. And I'll just give you an example from this week, and then I'll sort of wrap up and go to questions. This week, I was delighted when the Supreme Court yet again intervened in an administrative decision and decided that the fact that Israel had not promulgated key regulations on PFAS chemicals, the so-called forever chemicals, things like Teflon, whatever. You can see the Black Waters movie about it. The fact they had done that was patently unreasonable. We'd had hearings about it and said, 4 years ago, the Ministry of Environment said that it was important. These regulations have been around. We had the chief toxicologist of the Ministry of Health say they're all behind it. How is it possible that this hasn't happened? And all these hearings that you had that I convened were all on TV, or the Knesset channel has it going, so you could, put it on Facebook afterwards. And we really hammered them, but of course nothing happened. But the Adam Tev V'Din, the Israel Union for Environmental Defense, a wonderful legal NGO that I founded many years ago, decided they were going to sue the government. And they said, you want to come on board? We're basing everything on the testimonies from your hearings. I said, yeah, I'm all on board. And just this week, I guess if we're counting within the week, the Supreme Court said that is unreasonable. You have 3 months to promulgate those regulations or else. And I say that because we look to the Supreme Court in the environmental world for those kinds of interventions. When the government is not doing its job, and frequently it's not for any number of reasons, we need to have a responsible adult, somebody who looks at the laws, who looks at the national good and not by necessarily the narrow political constraints, and intervenes, not all the times, but when they feel there is a compelling and, I would say, unreasonable inadequacy or failure by the government. And that's why this week is the best of times and the worst of times, because the best of times, the Supreme Court showed yet again how important it is, but the worst of times because the Knesset is racing to pass a law which would limit the very same argument, the so-called the ilat svirut, the unreasonable basis on which a administrative action can be disregarded. They're trying to basically eviscerate it. And if they do that, we will be missing a critical tool in the democracy toolbox for the public to hold decision makers' feet to the fire. And that's why I want to salute all the wonderful people, the young generation and the old, but particularly young generation, which has stepped up the plate and really brought the battle for Israel's democratic future to the streets. And today, I don't know if you saw it, 5 hours, the Ayalon was closed, people were arrested, and they are not letting this go away because it's their future. But it's not just their future, it's all of our future. All of us who care about Israel deeply. And I think that when I look to the Israel Ride, I know that that's a space where we share common ground. There's people come from all different political backgrounds, but we all have a common love for the land of Israel, which is, I would say, elicited with greater power when you're on a bicycle and can see so much of it in a single day. And we all share a commitment to peace and pursuing peace in the Middle East. We pursue a commitment to the strengthening of relationships between Israel and the Jewish communities around the world, and coming to Israel is an important statement. So I would ask that all of you who are indecisive or on the fence at present with regard to the ride, to double down on Israel and come on the ride and be part of this incredible tradition that David has been leading now for so many years so ably. It's really an amazing opportunity to refill your own personal batteries, to kind of reboot the computer and get off of your phones and your screens and really look at what our promised land has to offer, and to make a statement that, yes, we're part of this incredible Third Jewish Commonwealth, and being part of the Israel Ride means we're going to make it a better place. So I'm going to leave it at that. I have much more to say, but I want to make sure we have time for questions, and time flies when you're doing a Zoom. So I'm passing it back to you, David. Let's hear what the participants have to say.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate all your comments. I always have questions for you, but let me see first what questions others have. Also, I'll start with one. Been interesting to me as this year goes on. I am actively engaged with recruiting for the ride. And we have some riders this year, and this a little bit echoes one of your closing comments, but we have some riders this year who are coming on the ride this year because of the current situation, and they really do want to be in Israel to show their support and be part of the dialogue. I have talked with at least one other, actually an Israeli expat who's lived in the US for 30 some years now, who basically felt this is the end of the Israeli Commonwealth and isn't quite up to going right now. I'm curious, how do you respond to that second part? Because that's, I mean, to me, that's being overwhelmed by some of what we see in the news without context for interpreting it, but it actually came from an Israeli patriot expat.
Well, I think that's, I would say, ridiculous that that's the end. And he who says that should take himself down to Kaplan Street on Saturday night or to 100 different sites and see Israelis standing up for what they believe in, and see the courageous Chief Justice and how she stands up, and our wonderful, all women, by the way, Attorney General, who has stood up to unimaginable pressures. I think it's very important that we make the point that this battle for democracy is not a partisan one in the conventional sense of the word. Yes, a higher percentage of Likud supporters are in favor of the judicial reforms, but the vast majority of Israelis are opposed. And when people are looking at the moral compass of Israel, I always look to President Herzog, who I think has an unbelievable capacity and capability to assess the national mood and what constitutes the national interest. I can only say that the, I would say, criminal disregard for this national consensus, I think 65, 70% are happy with it, don't want to have I think only 20, 22% are actually strongly in favor. It's great for me politically because the Blue and Eyed Party, which presently has 12 seats, now has 28 or 29, depending on which poll you're looking at, which means that I might yet get to be a non-Norwegian member of Knesset in the next round, which would be great. I mean, I have every aspiration to return, and actually meeting Benny Gantz, my party chair, in 10 days when I get back to Israel. But I think it's for people who are giving up on that. I don't want to get involved in American politics, although I have much to say on that. But I've heard similar despondent comments by people who were, depressed during the Trump years. Well, I don't think democracy ended. I think it stayed because people fought to retain it. And people are complacent. And if he feels that way, then that's just a pity, because he's thrown up a white flag long before anybody else has. And I believe that we love our Israel, and we've shown already how we've managed to save it. And they're brave Israeli soldiers out there fighting terrorists in Jenin the last couple of days. It's the least we can do to give them a democratic country that's worthy of being saved. So that would be my response to your cynical friend.
Thank you. He wasn't a friend, just a cynic, but appreciate the response. One question in the chat from Neil Epstein, and I'll read it so I don't misinterpret any part of it. The Knesset's moving quickly to dismantle the Israeli Bar Association's role in selecting Supreme Court judges. What is the status of that, and how can we or protesters respond to that?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I can answer it as a member of the Israeli Bar Association now for, 35 years. I don't know. I mean, I'm a great lover of the Israeli Bar Association. They charge a lot of money for membership, and they give you nothing. But they do have one important role in Israeli democracy, and that's their membership, 2 seats on the vaunted committee for judicial appointments. There's 9 people in that committee under the present system that's been around for decades, which includes 4 politicians. The chair is the Minister of Justice, and another minister, and then a member of the opposition and the coalition. That's 4 there, 3 Supreme Court justices and 2 members of the bar. And there is an attempt to change that makeup. So there'll be an entirely political makeup. Now they want to make it 5 members of the opposition, 5 members of the coalition. That's a pity. I think the Bar Association offered a modicum of professionality. I think if there's anything we can learn from the, I would say, disgraceful decisions of the Supreme Court in the last several months, American Supreme Court, it's that we don't want to go that route of politicized justices who we know exactly how they're going to vote by who appointed them. We'd like to hope that there's a better way to do it. I think we have a better way. And I want to explain, it's really, people don't understand the difference between the Israeli Supreme Court and the American one. Let me explain that, and then I'll get back to the Bar Association. But the Israeli Supreme Court is an appellate court, and it's a high court of justice. The High Court of Justice deals with all administrative hearings, and that would be like yours, First, Second, Third, Fourth Circuit courts against the national government, as well as all of its constitutional issues. That's on one side. But at the same time, anybody who has been sentenced to a crime of 3 years or more, a felony, has the right of appeal to the Supreme Court. Anybody who's got a civil suit of a few $1 million has the right of appeal to the Supreme Court. So that's why they meet in groups of 3. They don't meet in, all together like they do in America, because they are unbelievably diligent people. They work all the time, and they have to be experts about everything: civil procedure, criminal procedure, tort law, contract law, everything, because it all comes up there. If we let this be a politicized process, we won't have that quality of justice. Now, President Herzog has spoken, I think, openly about the need to diversify. There has been a bit of a Ashkenazic male bias, but that's happened, already starting to happen. We now have an Arab member of the Supreme Court, more women. Women have been running the Supreme Court. Dorit Benish, this is our 3rd now Chief Justice who's a woman. And I think the people who come from Mizrahi, non-Ashkenazic backgrounds have taken their fair place in the court. But I would think it would be a pity of that. Now, having said that, the attempt to close down the Israel Bar Association is a result of the elections for the chair, which happened last week. There were 2 candidates running. One of them was Efi Naveh, and he was a past member of the chair of the bar, who was unceremoniously sort of tossed out because he traded sexual favors for promotion of a woman who wanted to be a judge. That was the charge, and she went on TV and confirmed that she had an affair with him, and then he just coincidentally intervened on her behalf. So Efi Naveh ran, and he's sort of a ne'er-do-well, but he also was openly in favor of the judicial reforms, hoping this might help him. And the Bar Association, for the first time, I never voted for the Bar Association chair because it's all, minor league politics, which you sort of don't, you have to take a shower if you throw yourself into it a little bit. But 90% of the lawyers came out to vote, and the vote was very, very solid, rejecting Efi Naveh and voting for another person. Had Efi Naveh won, we wouldn't have that law. I think that it's a pity that, again, a politicization of a bar association, it shouldn't have anything to do about whether Israel gives back the territories or not. And that's really the only real salient difference that you can see between many of the social policies of them. And I believe that this law won't go very far. I hope that Netanyahu's attempt to change the makeup of that will also fail. And the place to start is on the streets. And the fact that already we had massive demonstrations, which brought the government to its knees, I think we're going to have to go that way again. I'm going back after 6 months, and I know that my Saturday nights are taken, but I think a lot of other times as well. There's nothing else you can do. That's what democracy is. When lines are crossed, civil disobedience is the only way.
Thank you. Next question is for Mike, and I love that it actually brings in one of the things I find most impressive of the work being done at the Institute, which is just teaching people how to communicate across divides. But the specific question, do you think Israel could use an Arava Institute equivalent to bridge the secular or religious or left-right divides in society?
It does sort of have one. I have a close friend, Elon Schwartz, who did one day of the first year of the ride. Elon Schwartz was a great environmental leader, started the Heschel Center for Environmental Leadership and Sustainability. And then he decided to pivot and create the Shacharit Center, which does just that, brings together people with political aspirations who come from the Arab communities, the secular majorities, Orthodox, right, left, and try to look for that common ground. And I want to say this, I won a prize when I was in the Knesset for being the most bipartisan, or the member of the coalition who cooperated most with the opposition. And it wasn't like I'm any kind of a kumbaya nice guy. It was just because I worked in the environment, I think, and environment is something which is not politicized so much in Israel. And therefore, I was able to find many, many partners on the right and across the aisle. And I think that there is a room for us to realize, I reached the conclusion as a member of a centrist party, and of course it's self-serving, but I think it's really true, that about, let's say, a good 80% of the issues, maybe even 90, there's no real difference between any of the parties. We all believe that Israel should have a free market system, but are unwilling to give up a very dense social safety net to ensure that the poor and the disadvantaged are taken care of. We all want there to be better educational systems. We all would like for there to be a healthcare system which doesn't make people wait in the emergency room for hours on end. We all want there to be clean air and water. I could go on and on and on. Most of our objectives are the same, even in the economic frame. So I think that what's happened is that, and it's something which happens in the United States as well, is that many politicians, including the present prime minister, have seen the political advantages with emphasizing our differences and have exploited those fault lines for their own political gain. And I think that I hope, and I'm tooting my party's own home, but a blue and white party, which is now the largest party by far in the Knesset, will be a force as a centrist party. And I just want to say a centrist party is not necessarily one that's anemic, but it's that muscular middle that can bring everybody together and emphasize those things we all agree about. And I'm hopeful that that will come over. So yes, Israel needs to do a better job of talking to each other. The religious and the ultra-Orthodox are not our enemies, they're our brothers. And it's about time that they and us sit down and figure out what unites us and not divides us.
Thank you. The next question, which I might take the first pass at, but I'd certainly appreciate your insights as well. It's from Brent in Syracuse. Can cyclists include ending, in quotes, the occupation, civil and human rights for all those living in Israel and Palestine as part of the message we share with the public? And I think, just as a spokesperson on behalf of the RIDE, we exist to support the work of the Arava Institute, and that's where we align ourselves. But beyond that, we generally see other ways for the Institute to engage, and the Institute chooses how to engage. I'd note that our riders, it's an inclusive ride. We have people from across the political spectrum. We have crew, alumni, students who also represent diverse views across the spectrum. And I think, to me, one of the wonderful things about the ride is we actually, I hope, do a good job of creating a safe place for all of those people to discuss their different perspectives.
I would say this: when I started the Institute way back when, it was really a part of the general euphoria which gripped the nation at the time of the so-called Oslo Accords, when Israel, for the first time, was really talking peace and made a peace agreement with Jordan, created the interim agreements with the Palestinians. And so I too am frustrated that we still find ourselves locked in violent conflict, and no better time than say today, now that the Israeli forces have left Jenin and 18 Palestinians are dead and one Israeli soldier are dead. And this, horrible cycle of violence doesn't seem any closer to being shut down. I will say this, I'll quote my friend and the former director of the Arava Institute, David Lehrer, that trust may be the single most scarce resource in the Middle East. There's water and there's sand and all kinds of, but we need to do a better job. And as somebody who comes from a party which is not strongly linked to the so-called left or peace camps, I've reached the conclusion that the only way we're going to make progress, given the Israeli political, I would say, divide, and the fact that the majority of Israelis lack trust. They don't believe the Palestinians have ever accepted a Jewish state, not in 1948, 1967, none of that matters. They just don't accept us here. And I kind of feel like the Palestinians have given them ample reason to have that belief. What we need to do is create a a space where trust can be revived, flourish. I know that when I was working in the Knesset and Benny Gantz was the Minister of Defense, he worked very hard to create opportunities for Palestinians and Israelis to work together economically. Tens of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza came in to Israel to work. And I believe that's been a very moderating force. When we look at the results of the most recent campaigns in Gaza where the Hamas stayed out, I think that's because there's 20,000 breadwinners who support, a couple 100,000 people. And they know that if it goes to any more military conflict, their economic basic interests will be harmed. We have to create those kind of opportunities, economic opportunities, and most of all, a sense of hope on the other side as well, which I'm not sure that the Jenin, activities, as critical as they were to short-term security gains, are going to be helping us. So I do believe that the Arva Institute has a critical role. There's so few institutions who still have the faith that a better future is possible. And I don't think that there's any place for a political statement about the occupation here or there, because you'll find 2 Jews and you'll find 3 opinions, 3 synagogues and 4 opinions on the future of the West Bank. But we can all agree that the present situation is untenable, is undesirable, and that we need to do better for our kids and for the future generation.
Thank you. I'm just going to slightly reword Stuart's question. Not if, but when, that's my rewording, you become the Minister for Environmental Protection, what will be your first priorities?
Well, I'll be very specific. There are a few laws which I tried to pass, which I think were very important, and I'll just sort of share them with you. But we'll start with the first one. Israel has a wonderful system of nature reserves. We have national parks, but we have no real system set up for the many areas inside of Israeli cities, which actually, against all odds and miraculously, still constitute small nature sanctuaries, okay? And I proposed a law after having a roundtable which brought together all the players. We had the Ministry of Agriculture there, and we had the Ministry of Interior there, and the planning commissions, and the local government councils with the mayors. And my idea was, and it wasn't really my idea, I stole it from China, but the idea was that alongside the nature reserves, we'd have a entire new category of protected areas, which would be urban nature reserves, and in those areas, there would be protection of nature, but it wouldn't be as vigilant, say, as the nature reserves we have today. For example, if youth movements wanted to camp out there, they could do that. You could have trails with a little bit of light there. In other words, it wouldn't be the same entirely ecocentric place, but it would be a protected area where kids could get connected to nature. And I think that's very impossible. I think Israel has 2 environmental crises which we need to address with far greater commitment. One of them is the biodiversity crisis. We have about 1/3 of our vertebrate species are threatened with extinction. And if we don't do something fast to ensure the integrity of our ecological corridors, they're going to lose it. And that's on our watch. We received a land of Israel with unbelievable diversity of species, 115 mammal species and thousands of plants, and we're losing it. We're not the only ones. The whole world is going to hell in terms of that. 65% of the animals that existed in nature, not species, but the numbers of animals that existed in 1970 are gone. We're 35% stock of what we are. So the whole world is seeing this ecological crisis, but this is our corner to protect. So that's the first thing the Minister of Environment has to really get much more serious about, identifying where the species extinctions are taking place. And the other one is climate. I just finished teaching a course here at Stanford, and I must say that I worked extremely hard, because everything I knew about climate policy was no longer valid. In the last 3-4 years, the world is starting to go and take this crisis and address it. There's 61 countries with a carbon tax. I had to learn those. And Israel, unfortunately, remains under the illusion that it continue to take the path of least resistance and short-term ecological gain. And there's no way Europe, which is about to impose the so-called border adjustment tax, which means if you export goods to Europe and they have a heavy carbon footprint, you're going to have to pay a carbon tax to Europe. Israel doesn't realize that the world is changing, and Israel has to be in the leadership in terms of its climate policy. So that's an area where I would also, and thank you for the shout out, Stuart. It is an aspiration of mine. If we get enough seats in the blue and white party, well, then yes, maybe I could be. I'm certainly gonna tell Benny that's my, he knows that's my dream.
We will definitely be rooting for you. I have a question that is specific actually, or a little bit more specific to the Israel ride, which is this year for the first time, we're spending Shabbat in the Dead Sea Valley. As a leading environmentalist, any thoughts on things that we should be watchful for, mindful of, that make that experience unique, but also that we really want to learn more about while we're there?
Well, and one could say that you're gonna, if you make a pitch on Saturday night, then everybody's gonna be so depressed from the Dead Sea, they're all gonna write big checks because it'll be something for the good. But no, but the truth of the matter is the Dead Sea represents a colossal policy failure. It's not just our failure, it's the failure of Jordan to rein in the Dead Sea works there. It's the Syrians who put out dams and stopped the flow of water into the Yarmouk, which used to provide 40% of the Jordan River flow and now has zero. It's all of us. It's on our watch. And the Dead Sea is rapidly turning into an Aral Sea, shrinking and creating both the sinkholes and some other health problems and an aesthetic, I would say, tragedy. So I would make sure that you bring there's lots of interesting people. Clive Lipkin from the Arava Institute is a researcher. He's, I think, devoted most of his intellectual energy to thinking about solutions. The EcoPeace has some ideas. I tend to be a little bit unorthodox on this. I'm in favor of the so-called red dead canal, which I realize is imperfect and has certain environmental risks, but I can't imagine sitting and doing nothing as this incredible resource disappears. But I'd bring some people, some experts down there from the Geological Institute of Israel, from the government, that have done some very important work with the World Bank, their feasibility study, and see what options are on the table. I want to say something good about the Arava Institute as somebody, going back to my role as a former parliamentarian. The Arava Institute has something really neat called its Track 2, which is basically they bring together former government officials or really smart policy experts in the Israeli and the Palestinian sides and start talking about different policies and try to do things below the radar screen and sometimes over the radar screen to work together. And when I first heard about it, I thought it was like many well-meaning initiatives of the civil society. It's great symbolically, but its impact is minimal. But I want to tell a story that might question that kind of cynicism. I was in a meeting with the civil authority, the people for the Ministry of Defense who basically run the West Bank. And I was lobbying there strong. It was one of my major initiatives to bring more renewable energy to the Palestinian sector. I see Mike Roth and I wrote an article about the potential there. It's unimaginable that Israel exports 90% of the electricity to the West Bank, to the Palestinians, and they're given very, very little opportunity to generate their own renewable solar energy. So that was something that I pushed very hard. And as we got to talking about it, and they started talking about it, they said, well, if you want to make this happen, you should go to the Arava Institute, because they were talking about the need for there to be Palestinian partners. They have real Palestinian partners. They're really making things happen. They had no idea that I had anything to do with the Institute. I said, who's that organization? Yeah, there's this group down there in the Arava. And I said, wow, this is coming from the Israeli establishment. Even this, I would say, the right-wing establishment that's not exactly a zealot on behalf of Palestinian solar rights. And here they are saying the Arava Institute is getting things done. And if you want to talk to pragmatic people. So that's, I think, a shout out to people who've worked long and hard in this area. And I was very pleased to hear that. It's been much harder with the present government, naturally, which has no interest at all in empowering Palestinians. But I think that when there was a government that was more open, there was an important contribution that was being made. And I could see the Arava Institute ready to make it once again. And once we bring down this government and replace it with something a little more sane.
Thank you. I'm curious, you said something in your introductory comments that reminded me of a conversation years ago with the our newly elected congressman from my district. And someone was asking him what his high priorities were as he entered Congress. And his response was, I'm the most junior member of Congress. Really, I have no power, but the one power I do have is to bring people together to talk about things. And that's substantially what you said at the top of the hour. I'm curious, when you get back to Israel, you're not in the current government, but what will you be doing to bring people together and to foster some of this discussion we've been just having?
Well, one of the first thing we did in the Knesset was I started a group. We used to call ourselves the Green Parliamentarians, or Mechokakim Yerukim. That was what the WhatsApp group was called. From all the different factions within the coalition, that was right wing, left wing. Each one had a green champion, and then we brought together people from Likud and found the green people on the other side to start talking about a common agenda. So I think that's easy to do. It's been done before. There is a so-called shtulah, a lobby for the environment, which is made of Knesset members. When we talk about lobby in the Israeli context, it's different than America. It's not a lobbyist from the outside. It's Knesset members who all agree about something, irrespective of their political affiliations. So I think there is tremendous opportunity to do that. And I think it's important, especially when we're talking about something like environment or big issues, that we have people on all sides. I want to respond. I think Mathis raised a question here. If I'm not correct, incorrect, I think he asked, if I'm not mistaken, oh, that was Neil Epstein. If a large majority is really against the judicial coup, could they stop laws that would change democracy? We had such a situation just 2 weeks ago. There was a vote for the members on the so-called judicial appointment committee. And at the last minute, the Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu realized that he had a problem on his hand. He hadn't worked out who's going to be. He wanted to. So he said, we're going to postpone this election. And the way we're going to postpone it is we're going to see that there wouldn't be 50% supporting any candidate. You have to get at least 50% of the votes to get on the committee. Now, the opposition that's not in power has maybe 47%, 46% of the votes. So it was clear that none of them would be able to, their candidate who was supposed to be a member of the Judicial Appointments Committee would not get elected, Karine Elahar, the past Minister of Energy. And against all odds, she got elected in. In other words, 4 members of Likud, it was a secret ballot, voted against the government. And that's very different than voting against your government when you're open. And there's 2 ways you can vote in the Knesset, unless it's specifically for a person like this kind of a job. You can either vote electronically, where they say, okay, ba'ad, neged, for, against, you have 10 seconds to vote and you push your button, and 10 minutes later the results, or they call your name up. And in any case, every vote that I ever took is registered, marked, and I'm accountable to them. Okay, and there's some votes that I am very uncomfortable with, because I had to vote against my conscience, because that's the nature of a coalition. You vote for what the other parties want, and they supposedly vote for your party's priorities. But I don't think under the present charged and polarized environment, it'll be very easy, even for the intrepid members of the Likud, people like Yuli Edelstein, or we've seen a very brave Duri Biton. There's been some surprises there, people stepping up. But behind the veil of the election box, we saw a little more courage than I think we'll see when people have to come out themselves and vote. I hope I'm wrong, but so far we haven't seen any of that kind of courage. Once Yuli Edelstein skipped 1 vote because he didn't want to be party to it.
Excellent. We've exhausted the questions in the chat. If there are 1 or 2 questions, oh, wait, 1 more message just came up. A question from Neil. You've praised President Herzog. Is he having an influence to moderate the weakening of the judicial reforms?
Without President Herzog, the judicial reform would have passed a long time ago. In other words, there was sort of a damn the torpedoes kind of attitude of the government. We're going to get this thing through anyway. But once he gave the moral legitimacy to the protesters and said, we need to do this as a national consensus, many people on the right, voters on the right, came over because they said, I can't be part of this. For 4 elections, 5 now, we in the Blue and White Party were looking for those so-called moderate right voters, and we couldn't find them. They weren't reflected in our votes. And now in the polls, 10 members of people, 10 seats that used to go to the Likud now are with us. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Herzog justifiably has established himself as a voice of reason, of decency, and of objectivity. So yeah, I want to say this out there. And I want to say also something about Herzog. I'm very fond of the guy. His mother, Ora Herzog, was an environmentalist. She was basically the founder and ran for many years an environmental group called the Council for Beautiful Israel. They have a big center on the Yarkon. And I was at the time a young environmentalist. She liked me because I was, I don't know, something different or whatever. And so she liked me. So Herzog always liked me. And then when he became the prime minister, when he became president, by the way, he sat with every single member of Knesset, and that is a pain in the ass. And he sat with every single one of us. And for me, he sat for an entire hour, which I felt was quite an honor. And when it was done, I said, I want to, and his mother passed away. We all of us went to his mother's funeral during that very year, the time I was in the Knesset. And I said, I want to get you engaged in, first of all, he created a national climate council, which brought together everybody from all sides and all sides of the aisle. All parties are represented there, under the auspices of the president, to try to think about how we can do better as a society to address the climate crisis. And good on him for that. I said, I got another thing I tried for a while there to revive what had once been the so-called Commissioner of Future Generations. Israel used to have a position, which I thought was incredibly unique. A guy who sat in the Knesset, his job was to speak on behalf of future generations. Like the Lorax speaks for the trees, I speak for future generations. He would go to committees. But the guy who had the job at the time, former Justice Sham, was sort of I guess he was annoying to a lot of people, and he didn't have a great emotional IQ, and the position was canceled. But I think there's a great place for it. I said, but why put it in the Knesset when it's all politicized? It should be part of the president's office. And then not only would it express his opinion about legislation, but all the government decisions, the like. And Herzog, God bless him, said, that's a great idea. And I sat down, we wrote a law up, I got people there, I met with his legal advisor, and by God, we would have passed that if the government hadn't fallen. So I think we have got a great president. And when you're looking for, tell that to your non-friend, the cynical guy who said, a country that elects Herzog, well, they're doing something right. So that's something very good too.
Thank you. And then a final question. At the top, I mentioned all the different ways you participated in the ride as a rider, a parent on the crew, a guide, environmental educator, musician. There's a lot to digest there, but what's your fondest memory or most poignant memory from all the years? And I hope there will be many more that you're part of the Israel Ride.
Well, for me, I loved being on the ride. It was always very, very special. But doing it as a parent added a new dimension. Because one of their challenges as parents is to how do we find ways, particularly as our children become adolescents, and there's that little bit of awkwardness, whatever, where we can bring back this sort of intimacy and comfort when there's all kinds of complicated things going on with them in terms of the hormones, and you're trying to set boundaries, but still this. And all of a sudden you are on a bicycle with your kid. And I know you've done it, David, and maybe some other people there have. And all of a sudden it's like you're on this mobile summer camp. Like you are together with your kid, have this crazy cast of 200 colorful, fun people. And at the end of the day, you can share, oh, I had this great conversation with this, and you can gossip about them. I roomed with my daughters at every ride. And we had such a great time together. And to distill that down to one event, I remember a particular Havdalah in Mitzpeh Ramon. It was the tradition at the time to go over to the edge of the Machtesh. God forbid anybody should say crater, Machtesh, and to look over there and have Havdalah. And I had a guitar. They said you have to come play the guitar, and so I did. And there's a particular melody from the Rose, those of you know the Bette Midler hit, that is used for the Havdalah prayer. And I wasn't so confident about it, but my daughter, who was from Noam, the U.S. White, so she was very confident. So she sort of sat by me and got me through the words appropriately. And I think that was a moment and I wouldn't have wouldn't raise it, but all those photos you showed at the beginning, David, elicited all this sentimentality. So if you're really looking for a way to create wonderful memories in Israel and feel like you're back in summer camp with great people who love the same things you do and are really funny and fun to be with and interesting, by God, sign up and get on the board and be part of the Israel Ride. Who would want to miss that? Gosh, life is short. We're not going to be any, there's only a few rides left in us, maybe another 20 or 30. So you wouldn't want to miss one. So this is your chance. I'm going to take this last shout out to say, be there on the bike or be square. And I hope to see all of you in Israel in November, right? It's in November this year. And
Yep. End of October.
be part of the people of the bike. Over and out.
Thank you very much. As always, just amazing to have the opportunity to be with you, listen to you, learn from you, and get your answers to some of our questions. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again on this year's Israel Ride, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. It was really a pleasure to see so many people, familiar faces, and some new faces. So thank you very much, and good night.